I kind of feel super excited to be here today. I don't know about the rest of all you. I'm a Nigerian, though, but you might hear so many accents from my mouth. I just sounded like an American now. Munasu Igbo. I can speak a bit of Igbo, so if you hear so many different accents, just take it from me. Okay, after the opening remarks on the, oh, you're welcome, CEO, Credit Registry, you're welcome. After the closing remark on the agenda, we have, sorry, I said close it, opening remark, we have the banking sector presentation. And Ike told me that I'll be delivering that presentation. And he told me that the Minister of Finance and the coordinating Minister of the Economy is going to be in the room with us today. And I then remembered what my mom used to say to me that, or she used to pray, where it's not only my mom, I guess everybody's mom does that someday you're going to stand in front of kings and queens, rulers, to deliver some speech. Well, I don't know if today is that day, but I believe in this room we have policy makers, we have decision makers, we have people who make impact on the economy with us in this room today. So I believe I'm standing right in front of kings and queens. So quickly, can we have the presentation on the wall or on the screen? I'm a bit of a village man also, so if you hear me say wall screen, okay, it flows, wall screen. Getting Nigeria to work again. That's the title of this year's banking sector report. And this is coming amidst a background which the group CEO just painted, that in 2022 we released one of such report titled "The Brace for Impact." And after an impact, during an impact everything goes. Then after the impact, you begin to think about rebuilding and getting things to work. So there is really a linkage, and there is a story we're trying to tell about Nigeria. Sorry, in what direction am I to point this? Okay, so like I said, this is going to be a super brief presentation, 10 insightful slides divided into 4 sections. The first is macroeconomic environment, just to keep us abreast with all of what's happening around the global and domestic macro economy. Banking sector in the last era, you might wonder what era is that? Getting Nigeria to work again, which is really the theme. And then banking sector in a working Nigeria. So you can see that there is really a trail. Macroeconomic environment. I wouldn't spend so much time on this slide, but I would just like to take us through a bit of a memory lane. That we've all have been drinking a bitter inflation cocktail. Bitter inflation cocktail. Then you want to ask me, what are the ingredients of that inflation cocktail? If you recall, we had the pandemic, and during the pandemic, to ease the pressure of the pandemic, global central banks and economic managers decided to release a lot of money into the system, right? With all of that money in the system, that's what we call money supply. So money supply picked up quite fast. The pickup in money supply, combined with the fact that they had to also begin to reduce interest rates, right? Then created that perfect inflation cocktail we're talking about. Then if you sandwich or you layer on top of that, all of the geopolitical crises or tensions we're having, the de-dollarization, the deglobalization that's also happening, right? It begins to give you a perfect picture of how serious or how damaged global economic growth has been in the last couple of years. So in real context, the global economy has not actually been able to recover from the pre-pandemic era. And despite all of the efforts that's been done because of what's happened, they began to raise interest rates back so as to curb the inflation menace. labor market is still quite tight, production and employment still weak. All of this basically leave global economic outlook still very fragile. If you're looking at the chart, to the extreme left, you have all of the averages in terms of global growth for the world. You have euro areas, you have the emerging markets and the developing economies, and then the SSA. Clearly, the advanced economies are quite matured, so growth is somewhat very stable and stabilized there. But in the advanced economies, they're still not matured, and you're seeing quite aggressive growth. This chart tells you the story of what's just happening across the world. And then in terms of outlook, there's not really much of a positive story to tell. So perhaps for a long while, the global economies and economies generally might still be under the weather. This then takes me on to talk about Nigeria. Where are we in the context of all that's happening globally? Like I said, we've been dealing with high interest rates, high inflation. Nigeria is not safe from all of this. It's experiencing its own share of all of this. Combined with that is the fact that we've had years of weak revenue generation, high expenditure levels, which then created massive deficits. In the last 6 decades, what we just did on this chart is, for me, this is a very powerful chart because it just shows you 3 CEOs that's managed the Nigerian economy since 1999 and how each of them has performed. But it's not much about how each of them has performed. It's just about the fact that it just gives you, in one single look, how terrible things has become over these years. In the Obasanjo era, we had average GDP growth at about 7%. Inflation was averaging 12.7%. During the Yar'Adua Goodluck era, GDP growth moderated to 6.5. Inflation also moderated to 10.5. During the last 8 years, everything worsened. But it's not even just about the GDP and inflation number. You have those bars showing you what is happening to debt numbers. Away from 1999 up to 2011, where you just have real debt, from 2012, you begin to see debt layered with ways and means. I believe everybody knows what ways and means is. Now, for me, this slide tells the story that we're now in a new era. In this new era, which we believe will last for another 8 years, analyst is going to shrink this chart to the left, put in one more image there, and then the question is, what is the story we're going to tell for that image? That image speaks to the current or incumbent administration. How are they going to perform? I think this is a key learning point, a key takeaway for this administration. I'm even looking right. I think what I'm saying right now, if I'm not careful, could do 2 things to me. Take me closer to the seat of power, or take me to where I don't know. So I'm trying to pick my words carefully. But what I'm saying in a nutshell is this administration has an opportunity to look at data, to leverage data to tell the story for the next 8 years. Quickly, it doesn't end there. So how terrible has things become? You know, earlier I talked about how bad revenue numbers are performing and how much expenditure numbers have grown. I don't want to go into the details. In terms of actual expenditure as of 2022, we're north of 13 trillion. In terms of revenue, we're north of 5 trillion naira. Now, why deficits? If you do the plus and minus there, you're seeing roughly about 6 trillion naira in terms of deficit. When you compare that to our GDP numbers, what does it translate to? Look at revenue versus debt number there, 99%. That means 99% of revenues we're earning as an economy goes into servicing debt. Total debt to GDP is 40.5%. I don't even worry much about that indicator. Why? because it's just GDP. I don't use GDP to pay debt. I don't use it to service debt. What I use is revenue. So for an economy where we see revenue, debt to service, debt service to revenue ratio at 99%, it tells you a huge, huge story that there is a problem. And then this is the one that tends to deceive everybody, fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP. Why? Because there have been a couple of interpretations as to where that ratio should sit. You have, according to the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2007, that says 3% is the perfect number, but we're currently at 6.4. So according to that act, we're in the red. We have the IMF that has recommended that for low-income countries, your number should be 5%, or your rate should be 5%. We're above that, we're in the red. We have, much recently, the Debt Management Office came up with, some very creative but in line with practice, to say that that number should be about 15%. So you can argue that, oh, this is still good. So I don't really worry about this. But that one in the middle, I am super concerned about it. And that's where the work for this administration is. Quickly, I'll dovetail into the banking sector in the last era. That sector has performed stronger than the broader economy. Why? The chart on the screen tells the story, so I'm not going to call numbers. The orange line, is that orange? I'm terrible with colors. Tells you that the financial institution sector, which is a proxy for the banking sector performance, is growing way, way ahead of the broader economy. Why is that? We've seen increased access to banking solutions, business expansions across verticals and horizontal business lines, and then the entry of neobanks and fintechs. These are guys that have added value, added number and activity to the financial services in GDP, and that's why it's growing way, way above the broader economy. But that's not just all. There are policies behind all of this. In terms of policy, which is championed by the CBN, how is the sector faring? We dimension this across 5 key indicators. First is price stability. Inflation, we know where inflation is currently. But let's even not look at current indicator. Let's look at it as per last regime on an average basis. 14.3% versus 10.4% in the prior 8 year, right? What does that mean for the banking sector? It means higher OPEX, it means higher CAPEX spend, which means profit numbers should be weaker, might be weaker, is weaker. Then the exchange rate also. We all know what's happened to exchange rates, so I'm not going to stress your hearings. But what implication has that had on the banking sector? In terms of global competitiveness, our banks have lost some grounds, right? Because if you dollarize their capitalization, the devaluation of the naira has basically allowed their capitalization to shrink further, which then calls or begs the question that when is the CBN likely to come back to revisit the recapitalization numbers for banks? The third indicator, monetary policy anchor strategy. That seems like complication. Monetary policy anchor, which speaks to the real policy which the CBN makes around MPR. Where is the MPR? How close is it to market rate? Over the last 8 years, there's been a massive gap. Is there going to be a difference in this new administration? What implication has that had for the banks? Massive. Again, before I leave that indicator, we've seen in the last administration, rather than the CBN to focus on their primary objective, they were more focused on secondary objective, looking at development finance, how do we support the real sector. You can remember during COVID, there was over how many billion naira that was disbursed to support sectors. Well, fair, but then it just clouds the minds of the CBN as an institution. Government bankers, or the government's banker. So most of the time, what they've done, or in the last 8 years rather, which is the ways and means we spoke about earlier, that they've been so focused on supporting the government by borrowing to the government way above what the CBN Act stipulates. Is that going to change in this new administration? Maybe not. Banking regulation. Yes, I did say they did well, although they did well, but they undermined the well-doing by some stifling regulations, such as loan-to-deposit ratios that was maintained at high levels in an economy where real sector activity is low. So you're compelling the banks to create risk asset to businesses that are struggling in an economy where ease of doing business is tough, and so many other issues. And lastly, okay, that's the last one, sorry, my brain. Finally, looking at specific numbers for the sector, in the context of how I earlier said that financial sector is outperforming the broader economy, and I spoke about some of the key 5 policy framework which serve as a bedrock for that sector. What's their number looking like? So in terms of top line, gross earnings, 2014, 2.9 trillion, total industry gross earnings. 2022, 7.1. In an environment where ease of doing business is tough, inflation was high, monetary policy, financial policy, misaligned, exchange rate, unstable, inflation, profit after tax also, but you can say that the margins is going to be weak if you do the numbers, right? 7.1, 1.2. That's going to be clearly weak margin. Total asset, impressively, also up 16.1% compounded annual growth rate, from 25.8 trillion to 85.1 trillion. Shareholders' fund also expanded within that period amidst this backdrop I earlier created. Now, looking at more specific industry ratios, non-performing loans, 2014, 264, 2022, 273 trillion. What does that tell you? Come to, sorry, where is my non-performing loan ratio on this slide? Anyways, come to interest margin, net interest margin. You know, earlier I spoke about margins. You can see margin actually contracted over this period. And that speaks to how much of a negative impact all of those headwinds I earlier spoke about has had on the sector. Cost of risk moved slightly higher. Return on average equity compressed marginally. Cost to income ratio also compressed. That seemed to contrast with what you did think that's happened, given that inflation was up, and I earlier said operating expenses should have ballooned also. So what's happened is that gross earnings grew at a much more faster pace. Again, riding on the back of the devaluations we've seen, many episodes of devaluation. Capital adequacy, which again tells a good positive, that regardless of those those challenges, the industry appears relatively capitalized. Quickly, getting Nigeria to work, and this is where my job is difficult for today. And I'm not going to talk much here because I don't want to go to where I don't know. Law enforcement. So the way we envisioned getting Nigeria to work was to think about some sort of transformative reform around institutions. Over the years, we've been talking about policies, exchange rate, subsidy, and all of that. Now it's about focusing on institutions. We've seen an administration that has come in that have started implementing those policies we've been yearning for years. Now, can they focus on institution also? Law enforcement. We all know what it is like. We need a reform there. I'm going to come to electoral institution, but I won't spend time there. I'll quickly come to judicial and legal. I will not spend time there also. I'll come to education. Education, yes, critical. Politics and governance, social-cultural. Social-cultural speaks to family lives, family values. How do we institutionalize those values we had in those years when most of us, some of us, young, the Gen Z, Gen Millennial, no, were not born? Those values, we need them to come back. How do we get this administration to instill that as a way of life? Getting Nigeria to work, some potential quick wins. So quick win in terms of revenue and in terms of expenditure. Rejig and enhance the national security architecture. Why? Because we've been suffering in terms of agriculture and food production. Luckily, we have someone in the house to talk about agriculture and food today. We've been suffering. People can't go to the farm because of insecurity. Oil production has been down because of insecurity. We need a reform there. Expenditure, so many things. From operating an incremental budget, we need to move to a zero-based budgeting system where we all know what happens. Downscale the size of government, especially overlapping agencies and MDAs. I won't talk much on that. The banking sector in the new era, what should happen? How do we envision this sector? So still again, we dimension how we envision the sector in this new era along those 5 key indicators I earlier spoke about. So to cut through the chase, just look at the reverse of all I said earlier. Price stability, what should be done? Prioritize credit expansion to critical sectors to boost local outputs. Anchor market rate to the MPR. That means do not allow MPR. Do not just fix or set MPR at levels. Look at what's happening in the market to determine where MPR should sit. Look at liquidity levels, gauge market sentiment as an institution, as a central bank, to make those policy decisions. Restrain from quasi-fiscal intervention. Quickly to exchange rate management. That grammar is big. Abrogate capital control measures. I don't even know what it means. But it just says that, hey, all of those things we've been doing around FX, in the name of we providing stability, and what we're actually doing is we're controlling and stifling flow of capital. Stop it! Next one, improve communication of policy direction to the market. I think this new CBN administration is somewhat doing, or is starting off on a good note with that. Return to an orthodox monetary policy regime. I wouldn't flog on that. It's clear. Restore the CBN's independence and transparency. It took us so many years to see the final accounts from the CBN. We need that transparency. It boosts confidence in the markets. Government banker, yes. We're not saying don't borrow to the government. Borrow. But borrow in line with your act. 2, the ones you borrow, ensure you collect them back. Lastly, banking regulation. They're doing well, but there's a lot more to be done. I spoke earlier about the fact that the Nigerian banks, on a dollar basis, might not be very competitive with global bank. What's the CBN going to do with that? Or to that? I think with this, I hope I've been able to convince you that I'm not a Yoruba man, but I'm a Yoruba man.